Now that you're all settled in, stand up.
Put your teacups down.
Put your teacups down, and your vest down. Teacups down. All the products that you bought. All right, so this is another children's song, but it's a participatory children's song. Follow me right now before we start the music, just to get the motions down. Move all you mountains that stand in my way. What? You want to show me? Oh, yeah, thank you. See what happens? Okay, watch Asha because she really knows the moves. Here we go. All right. Move all you mountains that stand in my way. Nothing can stop my progress. Move all you mountains that stand in my way. Nothing can stop my progress. Tall trees fall aside, every bramble I slash with the sword of freedom. Tall trees fall aside, every bramble I slash with the sword of freedom. You can see how the kids really like this song. So, here we go.
We may enjoy it as well.
Yeah. Give us a couple of. Okay. Move all you mountains that stand in my way. Nothing can stop my progress. Move all you mountains that stand in my way. Nothing can stop my progress. Tall trees fall aside, every bramble I slash with the sword of freedom. Tall trees fall aside, every bramble I slash with the sword of freedom. Move all you mountains that stand in my way. Nothing can stop my progress. Move all you mountains that stand in my way. Nothing can stop my progress. Tall trees fall aside, every bramble I slash with the sword of freedom. Tall trees fall aside, every bramble I slash with the sword of freedom. Tall trees fall aside, every bramble I slash with the sword of freedom. Tall trees fall aside, every bramble I slash with the sword of freedom. That's a winner. And now for a complete change of mood. This is a song called Krishna's Flute. It ties into the chakras a little bit. Because the flute is actually a sound of a chakra that you hear when you're deeply meditating. And so the Indian picture of Krishna playing the flute, it's actually God calling the devotee home to his or her divine self when you're deeply meditating and you hear that sound in the flute. So that's what this is about. I've heard your flute high on a cloud. Your call I can't resist. Oh, let me come and play with you. We'll scatter music with the dew and sound the morning mist. I've heard you piping on a hill. All else I've set aside. Oh, let us dance the mountain peaks. We'll skip with breezes on the creeks and soar the valleys wide. Your flute has called me to the fields. Now I've no place to live. Don't send me back, rejected friend. Whatever I call mine must end. All that I am, I give. I hear your call in every tree, in every flower and stream, and sweetest melody of all
song that heaven's joy recalls, here in my heart you see.
So that will lead us right into, it's a poem that Yogananda wrote, that Swami Kriyananda wrote music to, called God, God, God. It will lead us into a little meditation. Yes, the chorus is God, God, God. So I invite you, you'll want to sing along with that.
Depths of slumber as I ascend the spiral stairway of wakefulness, I will whisper, whisper, God, God. Thou art the food, and when I break my fast of nightly separation from thee, I will taste thee and mentally say, God, God, God. No matter where I go, the spotlight of my mind will ever keep turning on thee. And in the battle din of activity, my silent war cry will be, God, God, God. When boisterous storms of trials shriek, and when worries howl at me, I will drown their noises, loudly chanting, God, God, God. When my mind weaves dreams, dreams, with threads of memories, on that magic cloth will I emboss God, every night in time of deepest sleep, when my peace dreams and calls, joy, joy, my joy comes singing evermore. God, in waking, eating, working, dreaming, sleeping, serving, meditating, chanting, divinely loving, my soul will constantly hum, unheard by
meditate for a few minutes. And what we'll do is we're going to do a visualization through the chakras with an affirmation for each chakra. So let's just be silent for a moment, gather our energy. If we have outside noise, will just be a challenge to our concentration. Now holding your attention at the point between the eyebrows, and the way you do that is you're looking out through that point, eyes slightly raised above level, as if you were looking at the sun coming up over a high mountain out in front of you, so that your gaze is slightly elevated and expanded. We want to keep our concentration at that point, and simultaneously we'll go through each chakra and we'll affirm the qualities of that chakra, but we want to affirm the qualities in the spiritual eye, so that we're pulling the energy from that chakra into alignment with the spiritual eye and not merely strengthening it in itself. So it's a slightly split concentration, but primarily your energy is in the spiritual eye. So we'll start with the earth chakra, the first chakra, which is at the base of the spine. The spine runs through the center of the body as if it was a plumb line from the top of the head to the base of the spine, neither the front nor the back, but the center, as if it was the pole around which the whole body is hung. The base of the spine, right approximately where the anus is right where that first chakra is centered. The quality of the first chakra is the earth. So what we want to feel is that solidity, granite rocks, solid ground. So we want to rest comfortably in that, the security of that position. The first chakra also represents our security. We want our security to be in the power and presence of the divine. We rest absolutely certain in the fact of God's love for us, the uplifting, benign influence of Divine Mother in the world. Now, to give us the right understanding of what that earth chakra is, please repeat this affirmation with me. I am steadfast. Determined, unshakably loyal to truth. I endure and accept all things. With calm faith in God. I am steadfast. Determined, unshakably loyal to truth. I endure and accept all things. With calm faith in God. Now the second chakra is just a couple of inches above the first chakra. It's exactly parallel with where the genitals are, where the sex organs are. This is the water chakra. So with the steadfast loyalty of the earth, we know who we are, we know what we believe in, so we have no fear of flowing with events as they come. We don't have to be stuck or stubborn, we can move, because our security comes from our inner understanding. So feeling the expansive energy at the spiritual eye, and the freedom and the flow of the water chakra, affirm with me. I flow ever freely. On the tides of grace. I flow ever freely. On the tides of grace. Now we move up to the transforming power of the fire chakra. That's where the navel is. This is the third chakra. Feel the power of your own will gathering at that point. Feel that power transforming and drawing earth and water up into itself. Feel the resolution in yourself to use your willpower in the right way, which is not to try to assert your will over the world, but to first assert your will to bring self-mastery. And then with that self-will harmonized with the expansiveness of the spiritual eye, that's how the fire of the first chakra should be expressed. Affirm with me, I cast my thoughts, desires, and all past karma into the flames of divine love. Make me whole. Make me pure. Make me one with Thee. I cast all my thoughts, desires, and all past karma into the flames of divine love. Make me whole. Make me pure. Make me one with Thee. Now the power of the fire drawing up the earth element, transforming all limitation into freedom, taking the flowing energy of the water chakra and making that true intuition with the power of will, and then offering that fire of self into the heart, which is the air chakra. And now feel the freedom that comes when you have gathered your forces together and are directing them according to your higher aspirations. So now, on the air chakra, we'll repeat after me. As I radiate love and goodwill to others, I will open the channel for God's love to come to me. Divine love is the magnet that draws to me all good. As I radiate love and goodwill to others, I open the channel for God's love to come to me. Divine love is the magnet that draws to me all good. Now we've drawn the earth, the water, the fire, offered that power into the heart. And now we're going to let that power run upward and even more free as it transforms from mere likes and dislikes into being a flow of divine love itself. As we radiate to others, so God can flow through us. As God flows through us, we become ever more free and transformed. So now the throat chakra, right, at that little hollow at the base of the throat, that's where the throat chakra is. Very little holds the throat, this energy down. Once the 4 lower chakras have been directed into the throat, then the energy is able to soar very freely, merging into the spirit. So from this chakra, please affirm with me, free at last. My spirit soars. Into infinite skies of bliss. Free at last. My spirit soars. Into infinite skies of bliss. Now we're going to move to the medulla. And the medulla is essentially our resting place. This is where the ego, this is the physical point where the ego is centered in the body. And it is from the medulla that we look out through the eyes into the world. And so what we want to do is you take the medulla, which is the ego definition of self, the infinite identified with the body and all its limitations. You gather that together and you offer it into the spiritual eye. Another way of thinking about that internally is resting at the medulla. Just move forward internally and expand yourself out through the spiritual eye. Feel that you're being drawn by the sun coming over that high mountain peak that we've been looking at. Feel it's just drawing us, and we're just flowing out through the spiritual eye, freeing ourselves from all limitation by a conscious act of self-offering. So the affirmation that goes with that is, please repeat with me, I offer myself, and all that I am, at thy feet of omnipresence. I offer myself, and all that I am, at thy feet of omnipresence. Now all of our chakras having been resolved and upraised, focused at the spiritual eye, all of our energy moved from the medulla to the spiritual eye. This final affirmation. I awake in thy light.
I awake in thy light.
I am blissful, I am free.
I am blissful, I am free.
I awake in thy light.
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 I am blissful, I am free.
I am blissful, I am free.
I awake in thy light.
I awake in thy light.
Let's now just meditate for just a minute or two, and then we'll go on. Om, peace. Amen. On the table over there, this is the affirmations that we just did. You can pick them up if you like them. There's also this chart which tells you much more about the chakras than we have actually discussed today, but it's also very interesting. And they're both over on the table there. Okay. Let's see. I had thoughts. So, do we have any questions before I just plunge ahead? I had something specific to talk about. Now I can't quite remember it. So does somebody have a question before while I search for it? All right. Let me think what it was that I wanted to talk about. You know, a lot of what meditation is, and this is specifically true about Kriya. Some of you know this word, some don't, so let me just clarify it. Kriya actually simply means action. It doesn't have a more specific identification than that. So a lot of spiritual paths talk about Kriyas. They do Kriyas, which just means some specific practice or another. When this line of masters decided to help the planet at this time, part of the reason that they've incarnated now is because we are in this transition between yugas, which often significant spiritual lineages will come in at these different shifts for different reasons. Krishna actually was descending. It was exactly the same point of development, but it was going down instead of going up. And so he came in to help transition the world at that point. Jesus came almost close to the very bottom. 500 AD was the nadir of this whole 12,000 years, 24,000 year cycle. So Jesus came just before it, and the sort of the lamp of civilization was literally kept alive in those isolated monasteries, while the barbarians just destroyed and burned everything. And then after that nadir was passed and started up the other side, a lot of that understanding began to come out of the monasteries again. Strange and fascinating cycles of history. So when this line of masters came into the world again, they brought a very specific ancient meditation technique, which they simply called Kriya, and it was deliberate to call it something that was really just a generic word. Because the whole point of the age we're moving into is not the age of sectarianism, and not the age of we have it, you don't, be quiet because the Catholics are on the other side of the wall and they don't know that anyone else is out here. Exactly the opposite. So instead of having a word that was unique, they actually used a word that was ordinary. In fact, self-realization also, which is what Yogananda called his path, is also generic. I'm going to actually use legal terms. It is generic and descriptive, and therefore could not be copyrighted. This is the result of a lawsuit, a very long lawsuit. It was an attempt to claim that these things were unique, whereas in fact, specifically, Yogananda chose words that were not. And so that was because he did not want this to be sectarian. But so when we speak of Kriya, in the West, where this is less known, because autobiography of a yogi is well known, he talks about Kriya. But actually, Lahiri Mahashaya, this guru, learned it from Babaji. Lahiri is actually his family name. It was the Lahiri family. And Mahashaya means great. Maha means great, and soul, Mahashaya. So he's Lahiri, the great soul. Sometimes people talk about it as Lahiri's Kriya, because that identifies, in the Indian world, where they talk about these things different. So they'll talk about Lahiri's Kriya, and that means the Kriya of this particular lineage. The nature of this Kriya is that it works very specifically with the energy in the chakras in a very harmonious but extremely powerful way, so that by using the breath and other forms of concentration, but still simple, you actually can work with the Kundalini energy and circulate it in that pattern that I was describing, to the spiritual eye, except I didn't make it look right, because it goes through the chakras. But the Kundalini energy circulates like that. And so you circulate it like that, and what that develops, now I remember where I was going. When you get that circuit going, like this, and up through the spiritual eye, what happens is you begin to generate magnetism like this. So because the energy is circulating that way, the Kriya is an especially effective way to do it. But whenever you're meditating, drawing the energy to the spiritual eye, especially when you begin to know more what you're doing, you're beginning to create a circle of energy. And the reason you're creating that circle of energy when you meditate is, think of it like this. Most of the time, we're not creating any kind of inner magnetism, are we? We're chatting with each other, we're eating food, we're looking around, we're talking on our cell phones, we're doing our work like this, and all of our energy is just going out all the time, isn't it? Especially if we allow it to just go out on the level of the chakras rather than in harmony with the spiritual eye. If you think about it, that's when I was talking about the people walking, It's like, and some people you meet, they're just all heart or whatever it might be, but you know how people work. But when you meditate at all, what you're beginning to do is you're taking all that energy that goes out and you're just beginning to concentrate. All of you have learned the Hong Saw meditation, the basic meditation of watching the breath, which is really the first step of Kriya. It takes 4 steps to get to Kriya. Kriya per se is the 4th, but Hong Saw is the first. Energization is actually the 2nd, so we've done 2 of them so far. And when you're meditating at the spiritual eye, when you're watching the breath is actually the physical manifestation of the energy flowing up and down the spine. And that's why meditating on the breath is so powerful and can actually take us very, very deep. We begin to create a current like this. So what happens when we meditate? We stop dissipating our energy, correct? We stop listening, we stop talking, we stop looking, we stop moving, we stop reaching, and we just take all the energy that would normally go like that and we try to bring it into a focus. Then if you start doing the Hong Saw, you're actually, by following the breath, you're actually creating an energy like this, which begins to create a circuit which begins even to draw that energy even into a deeper focus, all the energy of your own consciousness. And when it becomes powerful enough, especially concentrated at the spiritual eye, because the spiritual eye is the connecting link with moving out into the superconscious, you begin to even draw energy in like this. Okay, so this is the word magnetism that I was using at the beginning. Magnetism has a plain physical dimension, but this is the subtle form of magnetism, which is why people who meditate, especially people who do Kriya or something like it, where they're really circulating energy up and down through the chakras and concentrating at the spiritual eye, such people become very, very powerful. Because all around us, all the time, is this whole universe of energy. But we don't know how to draw it. Or if we draw it, we just draw it and dissipate it. It just comes in and out. I met this woman once. I know that all incarnated creatures are the same, that all of them have chakras, everybody has a spiritual eye, we are all one with the spirit, except perhaps this woman. I have never met a person with less of a center than this woman. She was a realtor, I think, or a banker or something like that. She was just a constant dissipation of energy. Very energetic, very, very bright, very talkative, but it's like nothing stayed in her. Everything just went, I mean, I found it, as you can well imagine, not pleasant to be with her, my word. But when we learn to draw that energy in, to circulate it through the chakras, to use it in conscious attunement with the will, that's what makes people so powerful. That's what Swami Kriyananda was like. He was so powerful without ever showing that power like people do. You know, he wasn't using his willpower on us or anything like that. He just moved through his life. But there was always this extremely powerful current of energy connected through the spiritual eye, so that even in the quietest way, there was just this force field. So not everyone would feel it because it was subtle. But if you did, it was just... And I never saw him. I was with him in so many different circumstances for decades, literally. I was trying to think about this literally recently. The phrase I came up with is sort of a funny one, but it's the truth. I never saw him rattled. I never saw him lose his center, ever. I mean, in being assaulted by lawyers, being lauded by multitudes. You know, that life is a duel. When he was in India in the last years of his life, it was... They have this belief in India that if you can just, touch a holy person, then your life will be transformed. They're a little passive about it, but it's a serious belief. So whenever Swami would come in or out of a hall, and he had hundreds, sometimes thousands of people who came to see him at the end there, people would just make it impossible for him to get in or out of the building because they would just rush into the aisles to try to touch his feet. And he just couldn't make any progress. So they would literally make a cordon. You would have a cordon of devotees like this holding their hands. It was unfortunate, but there was nothing else to do. Otherwise, he could never get out of the building. And he was simply too elderly. He just couldn't. So they'd make a cordon like that so he could go through, and then people would just sort of try to reach over the arms of the people there. But it was, he was just the same. Or sitting in the courtroom being assaulted by people, he was just the same. Because all of his magnetism was internal. And every time we meditate, we begin to generate that kind of force within ourselves. And this is the beginning of real self-mastery. Because if instead of letting our energy get sucked out, distracted, confused by, I want this, I don't want this is who you are, this is who I am, people assaulting you like that, if instead we're in the habit, which we practice in meditation, but it becomes also an attitude toward life, where we're just always thinking in terms of all that I really am is this flow of energy. Because everything else about us starts with this flow of energy. I've talked about people dying and watching my friend breathe her last. In the very end, it all just comes to a focus, it comes up and it departs. If we're living, that is because we have that energy, and everything else comes from there. This is where meditation becomes just the fundamental practice. Because the more powerfully we can generate that kind of magnetism, the more we can then do anything else that we need or want to do. Does that make sense? And the battle in our life becomes to hold that center. It's really not about solving this problem or solving that problem. It's to hold that center. Because if I hold that center, as long as I'm holding that center, I have this connection. I have this ability to draw the energy in, and that makes me the master of this whole plane of consciousness, because that's where it all emanates from. Swami Kriyananda wrote a course called Material Success Through Yogic Principles. I gave a long class. It's on the internet. It's called Manifesting Through the Power of Yoga. It's the same course, but that's what I called it. He was in India. He moved to India in 2003. He felt called by God. He tried to do a work there in 1958 to 62, and then there was a blow-up with the organization that later sued us. And so he got pulled out of it and never got to go back. So 40-some years later, almost exactly, he felt God's guidance to go back to India. So he went back in 2003, completely different country by now. It's not that he hadn't visited, but he went back to live. And he became very ill. The climate was terrible for him. And he also started taking the karma of the project we were doing into his own body, which is something that advanced souls can do. Tapasya is the word. Tapasya means austerity, penance. And a great soul can work out in his own body the karma of situations and of other people. So he started doing this tapasya, this penance, for the sake of the Indian work almost immediately. He got double pneumonia. He was in the hospital. And he was barely conscious, and this doctor comes in and starts talking to him, because in India they recognize spiritual people and really respect them. So this doctor comes in while Swami's lying there, barely conscious, and says, "Swamiji, can you help me?" And he describes this dilemma, this moral dilemma, of the fact that it's difficult to make sufficient money in India, and the temptation to do dishonorable things is almost irresistible. It's almost like the system is set up, that you really are expected to make money on the side in various ways. And as he said, my son's in school in Canada, and I'm torn between Dharma, right action, and the necessities of my life. Can you help me? Swami said he didn't feel like he was much of an advertisement for the power of yoga at that moment. But the next morning in the hospital, he woke up with this thought in his mind that what's really needed in India especially, but in the whole world, is an honorable ways to move through this world. So he wrote this course called Material Success Through Yogic Principles. Later on, because there's a lot of prosperity courses out there, the question was asked repeatedly, what's the difference between what you're teaching and what other people are teaching? When Swami was finally asked that question, what's the difference between your prosperity course and Tony Robbins or all the others? I don't know what goes on in this country. He said, his answer sounded like a non sequitur. I am the disciple of a great master. That was his answer. And I had a lot of fun thinking about that. Why did he answer it like that? And then I realized that most people try to manipulate the material plane by learning the rules of the material plane. This is how you negotiate. This is what a contract should look like. This is how you assert your rights. That sort of thing. Swami's thought was, if you attune yourself to the spiritual level from which this whole world is manifested, then you're standing at the source. And if you recognize how to unite your energy with divine energy, this gives you intuition, creativity, unlimited energy, the ability not to be rattled, a sense of unity with all, just everything that you can think of that you need for success. This is where it comes from. And so this is, and the course goes all the way down to, how to advertise your product, how to get along with your employees. It's not that it's not grounded. It's very, very grounded. But it's all from, where does magnetism come from? Magnetism comes from an internal reality first. So once we have this, we have everything. We have everything that we're looking for. And once we're into a Kriya, we're also into a specific relationship with us. When we're doing Lahiri's Kriya, we're in a specific relationship to this line of masters, because if this particular expression, this particular understanding of Sanatana Dharma, of self-realization, resonates, then this is where we want to go with it. Does that make sense? Any other questions or comments on this? I am, of course, advocating the path that I've followed because I know that it works. I'm not saying it's the only one by any means, but of course you're here. And so you must have some interest in this or some karma to hear it. But I know that this is very powerful and very central, and it will work. And where the discipleship comes in on it is, well, I partly mentioned it by mentioning Swami Kriyananda's ability to take on the karma of situations and of people around him. You have friends in high places, and friends who are really looking out for your best interests. And it's a point at which you decide, it's a point of humility in which you realize that there are limits to what I can do myself. And that's a very important part on the point of progress on the spiritual path. In Autobiography of a Yogi, the first sentence of Autobiography of a Yogi is, I may get this, I'm close. The characteristic feature of Indian culture has always been a search for eternal verities and the concomitant disciple-guru relationship. It's a very interesting sentence that you can contemplate for a long time. We've played games, we've played trivial pursuit games with details from Autobiography of a Yogi. This is how we entertain ourselves in our community. But so people say, what's the first line of the Autobiography of a Yogi? And most people can say it, except almost everyone says the guru-disciple relationship. So that's the trick part of the question, because what Yogananda actually wrote was the disciple-guru relationship. And like everything that an elevated master does, there's a meaning in that, which is the gurus are always the same. And they're like lighthouses. They're just sending the light out into the fog. And we're the ships. And whether we see that light and relate to it, that's the first decision that has to be made. So until there's a disciple, that doesn't matter how many gurus there are. And so within ourselves, whether or not we know what path we belong to and so on, that's not what comes first. Everyone thinks I'll be a disciple when I see a master, but that's not so. It's the realization first that I need help. That this is something that it's just, I have a certain amount of power, but then I move into realms where I myself am the problem. And that I need someone with an outside perspective to work on that. And once you have that attitude of a disciple, then teachers and teachings start finding you. There's a very touching story told of Swami Kriyananda was giving a talk at a bookstore in Los Angeles. It was called the Bodhi Tree, a very popular bookstore. And they had pictures of many of the ancient and current gurus and teachers just lining the upper area just before the ceiling. That was just their decor. It was a very crowded lecture, and this young man came and he was sitting, he had to sit on the floor leaning against the wall, and he was just sitting back there. And Swami Kriyananda started talking about the fact, similar to what I was saying, but with much more passion at that point, about, you know, you don't have to go out and look for your guru. When you're ready, when your consciousness is right, your guru will find you. Just as he said that, a picture on the wall above where this man was sitting fell off, flipped over, and landed upright in his lap. It was a picture of Sai Baba. And as the man told Swami afterwards, he had been agonizing as to whether or not he should go to India to see Sai Baba. He really wanted to go, but he was a little bit afraid. Should he go? Should he not go? Swami says that statement. The picture flips off the wall, lands in his lap. He's looking right at it, and so he just said he picked it up and held it to his heart the rest of the evening. It was very, very interesting, isn't it? Once when we were, there's a play that Swami wrote, a one-act play, which is about a disciple who betrays his guru and then in a future life makes it up to him. And it's a very, very touching story. And finally he's reunited with his guru because his guru has reincarnated. That's the story. And the story is about Yogananda, named. It's as if the disciple were Yogananda's. And Yogananda had said he would reincarnate in the Himalayas in 200 years. So that's the theme. We were performing that outdoors at another ashram. Swami Kriyananda was in the play that time. He was playing the disciple. And just when it said something about, I believe that Yogananda is really up there in the mountains, there was a big picture of Yogananda just leaning against a tree. And with a great deal of noise, that picture just slipped down about 2 feet, like that. It was just leaning against the tree, and all of a sudden it just slid like that. Nothing moved it, except just that moment in the play. It's just like, you know, don't think for a minute that this isn't really happening. It was, you know, everyone was just, everyone's attention, and we all saw the picture shift. Oh my God. Once for me, myself, I had the pictures of the masters on a shelf above where I slept, and once in the middle of the night, Babaji just jumped off the shelf and landed on my chest. He just came, the others just stayed there, but Babaji just came and just landed right on my chest, woke me up, of course. Wow, maybe there's something here I need to think about. And once you just start, once you start it all, and you don't have to start with confidence, the only confidence you have to have is that the power is possible. And you don't have to have confidence in what that might mean to you, because it'll reveal itself. And if you start along one path and you belong on another, you'll just be guided. There's no competition here. It's just a lighthouse. But that discipleship is really what gives the action its power. Because if you're just trying to generate it within yourself, you can develop a certain amount of power, but you won't develop freedom, because you'll still just be reinforcing that energy. Does that make sense? Do we know where we are? Okay, you look like you have a question.
Could you see the last sentence?
I said, if you're just generating it on your own, you can develop a certain amount of personal power, but you won't develop freedom. Because in the end, your sense of I am the doer and I am the powerful one, instead of I am part of a greater reality, will be strengthened rather than softened. That's why Kriya is not even taught unless you have a relationship to the masters, because it's not wholesome for you. Okay, any questions or thoughts before I go into a whole nother way here? Any questions from this morning about the chakras? Are we clear enough on all of that? I have if you go on the YouTube channel, I have a 4-part course on the chakras, which is very comprehensive. And if you really want to really learn a lot more than I was able to say this morning.
Asha?
Yes.
You hear a lot about opening your chakras,
Uh-huh.
or unblocking your chakras.
Right.
When you hear about that, what does that mean?
Well, when I was saying earlier about what level of energy, okay, it means several different things. My way of thinking about it, I tend to think they're holes in the chakras. All of these are just words, friends, that, you know, we're not really talking about the thing itself. But if your energy is flowing in harmony with the spiritual eye, the energy is preserved. And it becomes powerful, and that magnetism is powerful. And you live your life, but your ego is harmonized by your spiritual aspiration. If you're just seeking for yourself, as I wrote earlier, you just, you literally act from this point, or you just are led by your heart without really contemplating something greater, or you're led by your fear of security, this representing security. Some people are just absolutely ruled by their first chakra, but all their security is outward seeking. So it's like there's holes. Okay, another way of saying that, and then if you want to talk about blocking, which is just as good, is when you try to raise the energy up, that there's such a grip on personal power here, that when we try to take that up to love, it just can't get through. And so a lot of energy gets to here, but then only a little energy trickles out. So that would be like your energy being blocked. Or if we're trying to get all the way to the spiritual eye, you could be blocked at any chakra. But to be blocked means that you have a lot of attachment to a lower vibration. You're not able to turn that desire for security. See, desire for security in my bank account, my IRA, my position in the world, my people loving me, my big house, all the different ways that we have security. Just, if you've ever been through a forest fire, or the Great Depression or anything like that. You realize that or carted away to a concentration camp, as all my Jewish relatives and ancestors have been. Then you realize that all that security is just, you can hold it for a while, but it's just so ephemeral. That has to be a reincarnational memory, because it's not like in every lifetime you lose everything, but you lose everything a lot of times. But if your security is that everything that happens is God's will, my, that's very portable security, isn't it? That's what happened to Richard Wurmbrand when I started talking about him earlier. When he lost absolutely everything and all he had was God's will. There's a story about him that I meant to tell this morning, amazing story. In his book, he was being tortured, it's the only word for it, by the guards. He was in a little cell like this, and somehow the guards were making him walk around, and for hours and hours making him walk around, and the conditions there are beyond imagination. I used to like to read these challenging survival stories. I don't seem to need to read them as much as I did, but to see how people really cope in impossible situations seemed an important thing for me to absorb for a while. But he's doing this, and of course the first, the natural feeling is that somebody is doing something to me, and what they're doing to me I don't like, the likes and dislikes of the heart. But the more he's made to walk, the more he has to dig deeper in himself in order simply even to be able to endure without becoming insane. So he starts thinking that if God is in charge of the whole world, and he particularly loved Jesus, and if Jesus loves me and is caring for me, how can this be happening except that this is what they want from me? And if this being made to walk in this circle hour after hour is actually what Jesus wants for me, why would I not want it for myself? I mean, that's a very courageous, and it takes a lot of faith and experience. But he said finally, he was so blissful, he felt like he could have walked for the rest of his life. And all that, he was still being forced by the guards in this horrible condition. But he just began to realize, well, his security, his joy, it was all about God's will. Everything turned that way because it's just your inner energy, and how are you running it out? I mean, the truth of the theory is proved by the extreme example. Especially, well, I mean, I met the man. When you meet the man, you could see this man is victorious. There's really nothing in life that has more power than that man has within himself. That's why I said about Swami too, I never saw him rattled. In so many different circumstances, he was never moved off of that. In fact, once he was in Swami had a lot of ill health. He ran a lot of karma through his body, other people's really, not his own. But he was in a cycle of karma. I'm not quite sure what it was. Maybe he had some kind of a fracture in his back, I think, something like that, compression fracture, and some other thing, diabetes or something was bothering him. And he went to the dentist and he didn't have any cavities. So he came back and he said, well, I went to the dentist, and he was just teasing, well, I didn't have any cavities like that, like at least something's going okay. So I facetiously said, oh, thank the Lord for little favors, like that, just a joke. He became completely stern, absolutely stern. He said, I thank God for everything. Just like that. He wouldn't even let me joke. It's like everything to me is a favor from God, and that was that. I mean, it was a serious corrective for me. How casual is that? Just, I like this better, so I'm more grateful for it. But if everything's happening because of God's will, how am I differentiating? So when our energy is blocked, is that we're seeking our security in a certain way and it's taken away, and we just can't rise that energy up into harmony because it's blocked. So we work. We work on it. We work on it with affirmation, with right attitude, with Kriya yoga, with meditation, with everything you can think of, to just practice until we have, removed as much of that block as we can so that the energy can start flowing again. And clearing the chakras, it's all the same thing. A lot of times, somebody asked me the other day, a lot of times people say that they're actually working on your chakras, and they may or may not be. It's To actually be able to shift the karma in the chakras requires an enormous amount of power. People can have an influence over you, but to really be able to shift the chakras is a very, very high level of practice. But still, people can raise your energy and lift your energy and do many things that are positive. Does that make sense? Any other questions about that? But see, meditation itself, and I was explaining that here, I think. Meditation itself, because the blocks in the energy are whirlpools, like this, and if you increase the flow sufficiently, if the power of magnetism of this flow is stronger than this, then the whirlpool just literally gets dissolved. And all of a sudden this energy is just flowing in the river. Which is why when you start meditating and doing spiritual things seriously, you just start changing. And you don't even know how you've changed. Because these vrittis, these vortices, are dissolving and getting sucked into the river. So you have more energy in a positive way and less energy being sucked over here, but you don't even know when it happened. It's just that things start working better. They may also work better externally, or they may not, but you have more magnetism and power within you to deal with them, which in the end is what you really need. So, yes?
Is it helpful to know like the profile of the entities of the chakras? Like, one is security and groundedness, and then there are some that are not good. So that if you observe that in yourself, you can work on it.
Well, the first five chakras, earth, air, earth, water, fire, air, ether, correspond to the qualities that you need for a successful life. And if you look at your life and can see that you're very flexible, but you have trouble sticking to the point, that you have lots of willpower, but you use that willpower not in a very loving way, or that you have lots of love but not enough willpower, then you can begin, and those affirmations are a very good place to start, you can begin focusing and strengthening the dimension of yourself that relates to the chakra where you can see that it's not happening as it ought to happen. And it's very powerful practices, and you can add to it, water, fire, whatever it is that represents those. And yeah, you can change yourself a lot that way. And you're not even necessarily working on the chakras, you're working on the manifested reality of the chakras that tells you that there's something that's a little bit out of balance in there. Because that's the chakras being out of balance, is that you're too strong in one area, too weak in another. That's the balancing that you need to do. You need all of those qualities are essential for you to be able to work successfully. No, it won't work to just have some. Are you raising your hand, Colleen? Yes. Okay. Yes.
The chakras and the qualities that you've been talking to us about in relation to sickness and health, and the chakras, maybe relating to different organs or physical level. Are you able to comment on how that may affect or may not affect a person's health?
Well, each of the chakras is the energy behind certain important nerve plexuses in the body. The whole body emanates from the spine, and there's collections of nerves that radiate outward. So there is you can say physically, these are the physical nerves that are geographically related to the first chakra and so on. Many people who do healing work will draw very exact relationships. If you have this problem, it means there's a problem in this chakra. If you have this problem, it means there's a problem in this chakra. I'll qualify what I'm about to say by saying I have never made a deep study of that. It's just never been my particular interest. But I've also never felt entirely comfortable with that. I don't want to challenge someone who's made a deep study of it, but I've heard too many things that don't work in my mind. I find it better to think, I've given a little bit about the qualities that you've heard. Security, flexibility, likes and dislikes of the heart, expansiveness, calmness. The way it works, to my mind, is you will be given the opportunity to learn what you don't know. That's the great, fantastic balance of this life that we have. Whatever we don't know, we're going to get a chance to learn. And if you don't face it now, you're going to get to learn it later. Isn't that terrific? Okay? So when you have, and there's all different means for learning things. There's emotional troubles, mental troubles, financial troubles, physical illnesses. But what happens to you will generate certain responses from you. And the responses, or the reactions, which is a less controlled response, will show you what the lesson is about. What is this bringing out in me? So you could, break your tailbone, and it could have more to do with your heart or your fifth chakra than it does with your first chakra. But breaking your tailbone, let's say, causes a set of reactions in you, and those reactions reveal to you where your karmic weaknesses are. So I find that a more useful method because, for one, it's individualized, because people could respond extremely differently to different circumstances. One person may have a need to develop more willpower. So they break the tailbone and they have to put out the willpower to face it and deal with it. Another one may have to learn to just relax and accept. Another man who had a terrible medical problem in his appendix, I don't know what you would say that was about. For him, it turned out to be all about the fact of loving. He really learned to love his caregivers. And he had sort of a block to letting people be close to him. And suddenly he found himself having to be intimately cared for by total strangers. And that was the lesson for him, and it was really about the heart, just beginning to see his unity with all people. It came from the appendix. But the circumstances brought that important lesson. I mean, it turned out for him to be just an enormous blessing to have to be rushed to the hospital for an emergency appendectomy. But it all was really about what you might call blocks in his heart chakra. Okay? Does that help?
Thank you.
What were you going to ask, Seb?
I might have trouble formulating this question.
Do your best.
But, so, that great flow of energy that you need to clear the chakras.
Right.
I guess how do you do that? Is that's probably like the big question.
No, but that's the question. Like, okay, nice theory, Asha. What do we do about it? Yeah. Let's get real here. Sounds good, but
I guess what I'm asking is will it be like graduating through the different techniques of the Kriya that lets you do that, or is it bigger than that?
Anything that you do that takes any of those qualities and directs them in an up, that elevates them even slightly. If you're absolutely greedy, you're totally concerned about your money, and then you manage to give $1 to a hungry person, that's an upward moving action, because that's more than you were doing before. If you're very small in your heart and you finally decide that you'll, give a crumb to your starving nephew, that's progress. And anytime you do anything that lifts your energy at all, then relatively speaking, or comparatively, you're moving up. So meditation, and especially Kriya or a technique like it, because it works so directly with increasing the flow in the chakras, dissolving the vrittis, strengthening the magnetism internally, that is the most subtle, the most effective thing you can do. But all upward moving actions and positively expansive actions will help. And so that's why in a balanced spiritual life, you don't just meditate, you also serve. You're generous with your time, your money, your talents, because all of that moves you from a tight sense of my security is all based on me to a harmony with a greater reality. So different, when you get really deeply into the practice of yoga, bhakti yoga is devotion, karma yoga is service, jnana yoga is philosophical understanding. Well, that's one way of saying it. And raja yoga is the practice of meditation. And all four are needed. Devotion of the heart, clarity of the mind, physical giving of yourself and your resources, which includes your money and everything, and then the practice of meditation. And it all works together. Depending on who you are, depends on which way you're oriented. I'm a sevaka. I'm a person who really, seva means selfless service. I was saying the other night, some of you were here, when I first came to Ananda Village and I was cooking all the time, it helped me a great deal to unblock energy in my chakras because I was just having to concentrate on giving. And that, of necessity, took me out of a lot of other smaller vrittis, increased this flow of energy, increased my magnetism. And then at the same time I was doing other things, but that selfless service was vital to what I was doing. And then the philosophical ideas that I was beginning to formulate, that gave me power to hold the energy where it needed to be held. This whole question of God's will, I mean, that's a call from the heart, but it's also, an intellectual understanding. If you spend a long time really studying this or contemplating it in any way, and this simple fact begins to assert itself to you, then that helps you also. I was rescued from a great sadness in my life by what helped Richard Wurmbrand. It wasn't nearly as dramatic as his, but I was pretty darn at the bottom of my little dark well. And then that thought came, do you think this could be happening outside of God's will? I mean, I remember at the time I was a little annoyed because the thought came unbidden, and I was a little annoyed because I wanted to be mad at someone. And all of a sudden I couldn't be. And that's the Jnana Yoga, it's called. Just where the power of what you know helps direct you. So follow your own temperament. This is the art and the science. Yeah, exactly. You have to just sort of be who you are. I meditate. I'm not the world's best meditator. I'm a serious meditator. I like to meditate most of the time. Much of the time I enjoy it. But if it wasn't for service, I think I'd have a hard time. I really love to serve. I always have. And I'm lucky that way. That's my drop kick soccer ball. Oh, there's nothing going on. Let me make somebody dinner. Let me just do something. It's okay. Does that help? Because anything that increases, I keep putting the little figure back up here. But anything that raises your energy to a higher level, if only willpower, you're just falling into lethargy, and you just do something that moves it up. That's the Kundalini rising. I mean, we think of Kundalini as so dramatic, but the Kundalini is always going up and down. And the more you create magnetism, even just giving your money away. I keep mentioning money. It's not like we specifically have a need for money here. Most of the world I'm in, we need money all the time. Every good, noble, or philanthropic work, Yogananda said, sooner or later comes down to a matter of money. Eventually, if we actually build something for Ananda here, we're going to need money. Where will it come from? Except for the people who love it. So the practice of tithing has always been very fundamental to spiritual life. 10% is what a tithe is. In practice, it's any percent. But the practice of tithing, and tithing is you give to the source of your spiritual inspiration. And you give, the reason they say 10% is you say, I live by the grace of God. And the fact that I can earn money at all is by the grace of God. And so it's the commission I pay. It's not mine. And 10% goes back. It's a very, very, very powerful practice. It's not saying this is a good cause, I'll support it. This is saying this has inspired me. I have to give back to what inspires me. But using your energy, and money represents your energy, using your energy toward what you really believe in really helps you a great deal spiritually. Tithing is not for the benefit of Ananda or the Ananda communities or anything. Tithing is 100% for the devotee. And incidentally, it does help things, but that is not the reason why it's done. It's because, where does your security come from? Isn't that an interesting question? Does it come from my relationship to God, or does it become because of the money I have in the bank? Very good question, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, let's take a little break. Tea break. Okay. This is us. I have just sort of one more slightly complicated concepts that I wanted to put across before we call it a day. So before I start in on that, because it'll take a lot of time, or much of our time, do we have any other questions or thoughts? This is your last chance in this little cycle. Not in your lifetime, or even in this visit, but is there anything that we have left unsaid that needs to be said? Yes?
Was there any thoughts as to whether, doing the meditation, say like daily, on all the chakras is any better for blockages than just concentrating on one, each day? Or
many people teach you to meditate on particular chakras. The trouble with meditating on a chakra is that you're slightly in danger of strengthening it in the wrong way. That's why Yogananda recommends meditating at the spiritual eye. Because if you meditate at the spiritual eye, basically all the chakras line up properly. And so even when you're doing exercises that relate to the other chakras, you keep much or all of your attention still at the spiritual eye. And even though you may be like trying to do the affirmation for the earth element, you're doing it in the light of the spiritual eye rather than at the chakra. Now that's not what everybody teaches. Yeah. But given given Maya and the fact that you have lots of vrittis in those chakras, sometimes if you put too much focused attention on the chakra, you actually, and as I said, end up strengthening it in the wrong way. I'm not saying it's dangerous. It's just not as efficient. Even though this might not seem as efficient to you, it's actually much more efficient. Because if all of these realities can be brought in harmony with your higher consciousness, then the whole problem is solved. You never have to think about them specifically. But you can work on them specifically, but always do it from here. Now there are exercises, and actually part of Kriya involves actually concentrating on each of the chakras also, but you concentrate, up the chakras, hold the energy at the spiritual eye. It's all progressive. It's not just simply stopping there. So if you feel to go through the chakras or have a practice, go through them always bringing the energy up. If you strengthen the energy, then raise it. Don't ever just strengthen it, always raise it. Okay? Because there's nuances. A lot of this is why we listen to people who've gone the whole route. Because if you're just climbing up the mountain yourself, oh, that looks like a good route, and you don't realize that it goes to a cliff that you're going to fall over. It's better to have someone say, no, try this road. This road will work. And these are among the nuances that they've offered us. Very good question. Any other ones? Bear in mind, many people, very, very, very reputable people, will tell you something quite different. And I just can say what I understand to be true, but I'm not going to say that they're wrong. I'm just saying this is what I feel is true. Yes?
It might be a dumb question, but...
there is no such thing. I'll preface it with that, yeah.
But the energy flows, can they be affected by physiological things? Like prolapse disc or a tumor or anything like that?
Okay, no physical thing can actually affect... The energy in the chakras is a non-physical energy. So nothing physical can actually affect it. Physical things can make it harder for us to concentrate. And so in that sense, it may make it harder for us to do the practices. But someone told me, she'd wrote to me, she'd had a hysterectomy, and now that she didn't have a second chakra, because she's been told that her uterus and her second chakra had been removed. I said, wow, that was some surgeon. No. But we are very, very subject to our physical bodies because we are. You have to Swami Kriyananda's capacity to, I mentioned how many things happened to him. His capacity to just stay outside of it. He had arthritis in both hips, and he had his hip replaced. And he never liked to take full anesthesia. He didn't like to go unconscious. So they did them with a spinal. He actually had to have 3 hip replacements because one of them had to be redone. And they'd given him a spinal, but they didn't give it quite strong enough, and he felt them sewing him up. It wore off before they finished. But he knew if he indicated that he could feel it, they would have to put him under. They had told him that. So he lay there without flinching, without in any way indicating that he could feel him himself being sewn up. So still, and just never said anything. Only later, when the anesthesiologist came in, the anesthesiologist, that's when it makes your face pretty, isn't it? But the anesthesiologist came in and asked him, checked him, and saw that he was completely out of the anesthesia and realized that it must have worn off in the operating room. But he had that kind of mastery over his body. The rest of us, as a rule, don't. Which is why many of the gurus, including this line, make a point of health. Because it's not that the body is so important, but if it fails on you, it's harder to transcend it for most people. So health is also important because, it takes a long time to get a physical body. I mean, to get your physical body in position to do anything. You have all those years of childhood and so on, and then, many of us, some of us are younger than others in this room, but it takes you a while to find what you're going to practice. So you want to have a little longevity once you get going. And when you're reincarnated, you're just there in a baby body. One of my friends, he was a very serious devotee and a fairly serious meditator, but after his son was born, and he just saw, this helpless little thing that just couldn't do anything at all. He said most new parents get a little ragged in their meditation because of all the demands. He became absolutely fixed because he saw that if he didn't really make spiritual progress, there he was going to be again for all those years of just sorting it out just to bring himself back to the point where he was. So he got very... And that was also the same answer. I'll just finish this. A woman in our community named Happy Winningham, just was her name. She had AIDS. She got AIDS really early in that cycle, and she lived quite a lot longer than she might have, but she had several near-death experiences, and she wasn't the slightest bit concerned about dying. But she nevertheless made every effort to stay well, to stay in her body, to not die. But she sort of asked Swami Kriyananda finally, this is really hard for me to take these medicines and do this and stay well. She said, when can I just let it go? He said, well, unless you're fully liberated and are never going to reincarnate. Now, I don't think they had a serious discussion about that because Happy knew she wasn't. You're just going to have to take another body, and that means you'll have to go through infancy and childhood and so on, and then find your spiritual path and learn what you already know. It'll take you so long to get back right to where you are. He said you should try to keep that body as long as it doesn't completely impede your capacity to progress spiritually. As long as you feel like it's still serving you and you're still learning. And so she took that, and she lived a number of years longer, and she and Swami both noted she made serious and significant spiritual progress in those last years, both by the willpower it took and many other things. It would have been a serious loss to have given it up sooner, which is an argument against euthanasia and other things that people, assisted suicide. You just don't really know what the lesson is at the end. And you don't want to just postpone it and have to face it later after all the effort it took you to get to there. These are complicated questions, but important ones. Yeah. Complicated questions, but very important ones. Okay. So anything else? So I wanted to just talk about, and some of you heard me talk about this in various other places. I get a little, but it's still worth going over. This is just, we're talking about progress. Progress is a word we've used a lot. Progress is hard to measure. So there are four significant stages of development, and I have this written out on a piece of paper, which I didn't think to print for this class. I meant to, but I forgot. So we have all of your email addresses. I'll just forward it to you, okay? And actually, this that I'm going to write out is the true basis of the caste system. The caste system right now is what Yogananda called India's unique misery-making karma. He said every country has their unique misery-making karma, and he said the caste system is now India's. But the original caste system which came from a higher age, we've talked about this, was an understanding that people are born at different levels spiritually, and that we need to be guided into that situation which will benefit us spiritually. Now, life is 100% about earning money. Education is about earning money. Everything is about earning money. But in a higher age, it's about enlightenment. So there are 4 fundamental stages of development, and the reason I want you to understand these is because all of us manifest all of them at different times. And it really helps us to understand them to help us understand what is forward. Okay, the 4 classic stages, starting from the lowest, Shudra. Yeah, Shudra. Is there an H in it? Shudra. And that is the equivalent. I'm going to write peasant. Now, these may not be politically correct terms, but this is what we're going to say. And this is a Kshatriya. Pardon me? Oh, I missed the Vaisha. Excuse me, I missed it. Yeah, the second is the Vaisha. And that is equivalent to the merchant. I'll explain this more clearly in a moment. The third stage is Kshatriya. And the Kshatriya is the soldier king, soldier/king. And the last is the Brahman. And the Brahman is the priest. Okay. What each of these is characterized by is, where does happiness come from? What do you do to alleviate sorrow? And how do you define your relationships? Okay. The Shudra consciousness and is the peasant consciousness, which means it's completely physical. And there's no imagination, there's no creativity. When you have Shudra consciousness, you can never imagine doing things any different than the way you're doing them. In a country like New Zealand, you don't have a lot of genuine Shudras. They just don't incarnate here. In India, there's a lot of Shudras. There just are. And the Americans, my American friends who go there, have so much trouble because you're dealing with Shudras. They can be very fine people, but they have no imagination and no creativity. And our American friends are always asking them to do it a little differently than they're accustomed to doing it, whether it's painting the wall or sewing the dress or weeding the garden, and the Americans will just explain the whole thing. The Shudra mentality will listen like that, and as soon as you walk away, they'll just do exactly what they were doing. And it just drives the Americans crazy. But the Shudra just has no creativity. He just does what he does. Now, sometimes we're in that mood, right? You have no idea, you just do what you do. The other thing about the Shudra is pleasure comes from putting out as little energy as possible, right? So the peasant personality has to be pushed all the time. And the only motivation, that's another word, the motivation for the peasant is fear of punishment. And the only punishment that is understood, generally speaking, is physical, because their reality is physical. And when they suffer, they try to go unconscious. And this is where we become Shudras. You know, I'm not feeling so well. Let me turn on the television, have a pint of ice cream, you know, have a beer, or what? Go to sleep. Because if I'm not feeling well, I'm going to try to make myself unconscious. That's how I'm going to deal with it. So the Shudra personality, the peasant, very uncreative in what it's doing, primarily physical in the way it expresses itself, and its relationships to other people are parasitic. What can you do for me? How can I just ride on your energy? Because pleasure comes from putting out as little energy as possible. And so sometimes we fall into that mood, right? Okay, the Vaisha consciousness, the merchant consciousness, the concept of the merchant is that I'll give to you as long as you give to me. It's you know, it'll be a fair bargain, but I'm not going to do anything for you unless you also do for me. Now, when the peasant and the Vaisha becomes motivated, if there's something in it for me. Now, when you're working with yourself as a Shudra or other people as Shudras, because Shudras come in all classes of society, you can't appeal to a Shudra's idealism. You can't say, you must do it for the good of the whole, because that just doesn't mean anything to the Shudra. If you say, if you don't do it, you're going to get fired, you know, or I'm going to dock your pay, or you're going to have to go and do that really unpleasant job. That's what's going to motivate a Shudra. But when the Shudra begins to be pushed enough to put out energy, it begins to think that I could put out a little energy and get more for myself. And so the Vaisha begins to enjoy having more for myself. Okay, but now the way the Vaisha, but there's no appealing to the idealism of a Vaisha. The only way the Vaisha will respond is if there's something in it for him. If you say to a Vaisha, why don't you not manufacture that DDT insecticide? It's hurting the whole planet. The Vaisha will say, if I don't do it, somebody else will. Because there's no appealing to idealism. It doesn't exist for them. That's just all they see is their own reality. When they feel sorrow, the way the Vaisha tries to deal with suffering is he tries to control the world around him. So we become very Vaisha, a lot of us, and it's always a deal. When we're devotees and we begin to get on the spiritual path, very often we still have a Vaisha consciousness. I've been so good, Lord, why aren't you taking care of me? I've done so many Kriyas, why don't I have a greater state of enlightenment? I'm so nice, why did you let them treat me that way? And what we're really doing is we're still bargaining. And so it's not a very advanced, now think of it in relationships. A Vaisha relationship is, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You know? But if you don't, then I won't. This is, here's the household chores, these are yours, these are mine, right? Well, you didn't do yours, I'm not doing mine. There's no generosity of heart, it's just always even. However, the Vaisha is willing to put out energy and be creative if there's gain for himself. The Shudra won't put out any energy unless he's punished. Sometimes I'm in a Shudra mood about things, and the only thing that'll get me moving is to realize that the consequences of if I don't are going to be really terrible. And there's no idealism, there's no creativity, it's just that the consequences are worse. I'm going to be punished. Vaisha is, well, it'll work for me if I do this. And the element of the Vaisha wanting to control the world is a very subtle one. Because the Vaisha thinks that if I can put out enough energy to get my children in line the way they're supposed to be, my house in line the way it's supposed to be, the environment in order the way it's supposed to be, the nuclear disarmament the way it's supposed to be, the trade unions the way they're supposed to be, the right politics, it's just this thought form that I'm going to organize it all and I'm going to hold it there. And then then the certain result is going to come to me. This is where we get Vaisha in our spiritual life. Okay? But God is not really making a deal with us. But what happens to us on the Vaisha level is we can be quite creative on this level. And an honest merchant is not a bad person at all. But what happens is we start enjoying. We discover that it's the creative putting out of energy that really gives us the pleasure. And then we may accidentally discover that if we give a little more than we demand back, that also feels rather good, doesn't it? And so we're put in circumstances where we're allowed to be creative, we're allowed to get to ourselves, but we're exposed to people who have a slightly higher consciousness. In the same way, Shudras, the principle here is that it's good for a Shudra type to be a servant to a Vaisha. Because then he'll be exposed to a higher kind of consciousness. It'll occur, he'll see the demonstrated benefit of this. Now, the Vaisha, the key here that the Vaisha tries to avoid his suffering by controlling the world, we gradually discover, over lots of experiences, that we can't control the world. No matter how much creativity we exercise, no matter how much power we get, no matter how much money we get, the world just wiggles away from us. And as a technique for alleviating sorrow, if you just numb yourself all the time, that doesn't work. If you try to get enough power and position to control the world, that doesn't work. So then it begins to cross our minds that maybe there's another alternative. And that's when we move to the Kshatriya level. And the Kshatriya level is when we begin to realize that the real battle, and this is where I started this morning, is with ourselves. Right? And the principle of a Kshatriya as a soldier is, we may think that a soldier willing to pick up a gun and shoot someone is not a very elevated point of view. But what it represents in its ideal is that I believe in something so deeply that I'm willing to sacrifice myself for it. And so the soldier fighting the righteous war, if there is such a thing anymore, but if the soldier fighting a righteous war is someone who will literally sacrifice his life for a cause he believes. Translated into spiritual terms, this means that I'm willing to sacrifice much because now I can think in terms of ideals. So the Kshatriya is highly motivated by ideals. And the Kshatriya is motivated by the thought, what is right? What is Dharma? And it's the Kshatriya level that you can suddenly really begin to think in terms of what is Dharma. And in our relationship as devotees with God, we start trying to do what is right. And you start meditating not as a Vaisha, because if I do a lot of Kriyas, then God will promise not to send me any big tests. I just meditate because it's the right thing to do. I mentioned tithing. I give in this certain way because I have looked at it and I see that this is the appropriate response. I believe in these ideals and I'm willing to direct my life toward it. Ideally, in an ideal society, which we are definitely not living in one now, the ruler of the country is a Kshatriya because he's motivated by Dharma and his ideal in life is service. And when the way the Kshatriya tries to deal with sorrow and suffering is by controlling himself. Because the impulse even to be sad is just an impulse of your mind. It's the likes and dislikes of the heart. So we begin to do battle with our own tendencies and realize, just as I was saying, the drop kick, the happiness, whatever it is, I choose happiness. It's not just that I'm pleased, but I actually have the capacity to choose happiness. And this is where, usually for most of us, we have the Shudra inclinations, but by the time you're thinking spiritually, you're operating here. And we're motivated, highly motivated by Vaisha thinking. We really can't help ourselves think that we're going to make some kind of a deal with God. I love the thought sometimes that, we have this contract of how God is supposed to treat us. And when he doesn't, we sort of shake it at him like this. This is the contract we made, I jokingly say, but if you look at the bottom, you see that he never signed it. That you signed it in triplicate, put it in your file. But he never promised, because all he really wants you to learn is how to follow Dharma. And sometimes you have to be challenged. This is the gymnasium. This is the doctor coming to Swami and saying, the temptation to be dishonorable is almost irresistible. What do I do? And we have a principle within Ananda, which we always follow, always, which is Dharma equals victory, which is if you do the right thing, then you will be victorious. That doesn't mean it'll come out right in the world, but that you will be victorious in the only way that counts. The Vaisha would say, well, if you can get away with it, what difference does it make? But the Kshatriya really knows, because the battle is inside. If I compromise internally, then everything is lost. In our society, mostly Vaishyas and many Shudras are actually in charge, politically. We have very few Kshatriyas. Very few Kshatriyas can last through politics in early Dwapara, because it's just all about what can you get for yourself. We were laughing in India, friends of ours, Indian friends. Some big scandal had come out about how much money certain politicians had taken out of the country and put into foreign banks, and they were laughing. We knew they were stealing, but on this level, and it wasn't that they were stealing, it was that they were stealing so much. That was just sort of what they'd gotten used to. And it's awful, but that's really where we are. Most of our school system is directed toward Vaishyas and Shudras, which is you behave in school for threat of punishment, you try to do well because of what you're going to get when it's done. Very little of our education is for Dharma, is to be righteous, to be good, to be educated, to be noble. And children who are Kshatriyas, who are treated like Vaishyas and Shudras, are just insulted. It's just an insult. Why do I care about that? I'm not here to get rich and get for myself. I want to know the meaning of life. I want to know how to be a noble person. I don't want to just be threat of punishment. But our school, one of our school teachers, because you will have children on all levels. He says if he wants the classroom cleaned, he'll say to the Shudra child, if you don't sweep the classroom, you can't go out for recess. For the Vaisha child, he'll say, if you sweep the classroom, you can spend an extra 15 minutes reading the book that you like. For the Kshatriya child, he'll say, the classroom needs to be swept. And the child will say, I'll sweep it. For the Brahmin, you say, you know, why don't we just do something beautiful for God and make the room beautiful? And the child rushes out to do it. The Brahmin level, the priest, there's no sorrow to be overcome. Because at the true Brahmin level, not the caste, but the true Brahmin level, you understand that everything is God's will. And your only motivation is to live in harmony with the divine. And that's what makes you happy, and there's no sorrow to be overcome. Because you've mastered all of this. So when we're looking both at ourselves and the people around us and trying to understand sort of how to move ourselves forward, you have to ask yourself, what is my true motivation in this moment, or the people that I'm working with? And how can I just keep moving myself toward this? So when you find yourself trying to make bargains, you instead try to be generous. And when you try to calculate your own advantage, you stop and think for a moment, what is the principle involved here? What is the right thing to do? And then just do the right thing, because where there's Dharma, there's victory. You understand? Questions or thoughts? Yes?
So where are these concepts coming from?
Where does this come from?
I understand.
Uh-huh.
Is it from the Gita? Or?
No, this is, now there is a hereditary caste system of which this is the broadest outline, which has 1,000 tiny pieces in it. Yogananda explained that the origin of the caste system in a higher age was that when individuals were born and their temperaments were assessed, they were educated and given opportunities that would help them move from where they are to where they need to go. Because these are the 4 basic stages of human development. Swami Kriyananda translated this very roughly. I mean, he didn't use these words, but he translated this concept into our education for life system, where we also look at the children and ask, who are you really and what do you really need? What will you respond to? Not what is convenient for the herd, but who are you and what do you need? And then this woman friend of mine, her son was, he really liked money. From a very young age, he really liked money. And she kept trying to not play into his liking money. She kept trying to motivate him as a Kshatriya. And they were a very picturesque family. There were 3 children and the parents. And Swamiji was taking some portraits, and he really wanted that family. And the little boy just didn't want to cooperate. He was about 3 or 4, maybe older, maybe he was 5. He just crawled under the bed and wouldn't come out. And no amount of, Swami Kriyananda wants to take a family portrait. Swami got down on the floor, leaned under the bed, and he said, I'll give you $2 if you'll come out and let me take your picture. The child shot right out. And after that, the mother started giving her son money. She started paying him to do things because he would do them for money. He wouldn't do them for the sake of the family. He just wasn't enough of a Kshatriya to care about the family, but he worked really hard for money. And when he worked hard for money, he started enjoying what he was doing. See, that's how it changes. You get the energy moving. And he starts having a good time and realizing that it's more fun to cooperate. And then accidentally, every once in a while, he'd do it just because it was right. I mean, he's grown up to be a very fine man. But she had to see Swami respond directly to his Vaisha nature before she had the confidence just to go, because her other 2 children were more elevated by nature. But this kid won't move except for money. Get him moving. Because that's the most important thing, is to get yourself in motion. Because then the energy will teach you. If you're a manager of people, this is very helpful also. Because you can't, just the same as the children. You can if you don't speak their language, you won't get any response. And if you speak beneath them, you insult them. Okay, any questions or thoughts? And even when we meditate, as I was saying, you meditate in different ways. There's a lot of religion that's very Shudra. In fact, the whole planet used to be held together by the thread of hell. People were good, not because they were good, but because eternal damnation was something you really didn't want to go to. And it was just like if you stepped out of line, you were in eternal damnation. It was very Shudra religions, and they're still out there. You know, that you do it not because you love God. Although Swami said whenever you're motivated by the fear of punishment, the natural thought is, how bad can I be and get away with it? Which is, and I don't, yeah, I mean, think about it. Yeah, it's exactly what, you're not doing it for any reason except to escape punishment, so how badly will I be punished? Which results in, and I'm not an authority on catechism, the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church has answered that question in pretty exact detail, exactly how bad you can be. It's categorized all the different sins and told you what will happen if you don't do them properly. Am I correct in this? So because they had to start answering that question. I mean, it's terrible. It just leads to ridiculous things. But a lot of people need a Shudra religion. I was on a radio show once with this man. He was a born-again Christian. I was there to talk about our community. I was going to talk about organic gardening and the goat dairy and stuff like that. Somewhere in all of that, he found out that I was a self-realizationist and I had this whole other thing going on. I'm not really quite sure how he found out. But anyway, he did. And his spiritual obligation was to witness the true faith to me. So we're on a live radio show, and he starts in trying to, to get me to accept Jesus Christ as the only Savior. It's a little like, okay, it wasn't a big radio show, but still. So what do we do here? However, I had talked to this man a little ahead of time. Before he was saved, he was a drug addict. And, being saved was a big step forward for him. And I wasn't going to touch it. I wanted this man to be saved because his alternative was really a bad one. But there he is, he's having to, maybe he was behaving in a Vaisha. What made him comfortable in the world was for him to convert me. And we're on live radio. I said, your spiritual beliefs do not include mine. Mine include yours. And I'm just not going to talk about this anymore. And so I went silent. We're just on the radio. I just went silent. And I was going to just sit there for as long as we needed until he gave it up. But many people need a real clear cut. Do this, saved, do that, damned. Because that's who they are. And this, once you get this picture and realize over incarnations we move through all these stages. And if you're a Kshatriya, you can't demand that Shudras not be Shudras. And you can't, as a Vaisha, try to take off the planet what the Shudras need. Because who's helping who then? What about God's will in the whole story? I was visiting a clergyman of a unity church in America, and he was in charge of some big peace movement at that time. America was at war with someone. One of my Indian friends, I was in India when America went to war with someone. And he just so casually said, oh, you Americans, you're always going to war with someone. Like that. And I hadn't really thought about it, but we are always going to war with someone. So we were at war with someone. And that's because we're such Vaishyas. We're always trying to make the world in our image, right? We're good too. We're into Dharma, but it's a bit of a tough story there. We used to do God's will, but we're a little bit off of that. But this man was really into the peace movement thing. Whatever he was doing, he was trying to get rid of all this, everything. And he just assumed that I would join him in it because it was just, he just assumed it. I said, you put me in a difficult position because there are a lot of people that it's really good for them literally to become soldiers because they may have had no energy at all or they may have just been doing nothing but trying to get for themselves. If they're going to discipline themselves to become, solid, strong men and women, and then they're going to go out and risk their lives for the cause they believe in, I can't take that away from them. I can't go to them and tell them that they're wrong. Of course, it would not be Dharma for me to do that. For me to do that would be to go backwards. But for them to do that is to go forwards. You see how generous this makes you? And how differently you begin to look at the world? Because it's the Vaisya level that needs the world to conform to your reality. And also, it's God's will that every soul be given the chance to learn what they have to learn. And if we just happened to incarnate on a planet where there's a lot of demons as well as saints, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. That's the only thing I can think of. But part of becoming a Brahmin, seriously, is to understand what the purpose of this planet is. This is an opportunity for all these different types to each of them to learn, and for all of us to be challenged by what they're doing. You know, in the presence of that evil, can I control myself sufficiently to still remember God? When you're shifting here between the Kshatriya and the Brahmin. That's Richard Wurmbrand. You know, Corrie ten Boom, who was another great Christian saint who was in the concentration camps for trying to save Jews in Holland, where she lived. And you know, her sister was Betsy, was a more advanced soul in Corrie's point of view. Betsy died in the camp and Corrie went on. But Betsy was always talking about the need to pray for those people around them, for all their suffering. Corrie gradually realized that Betsy was talking about the guards. Corrie assumed she was talking about the other inmates, but Betsy's deepest concern was for the guards, because she could see what, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. She could see the karma they were getting for themselves. And you know, there was no rebellion, there was just the realization that God has put us here for a reason. In fact, what Betsy told Corrie the reason was, after this is over, you must tell people that no pit of hatred and suffering is so deep that the love of God is not deeper still. And then Betsy said to Corrie, and people will believe you because you've been here. And Corrie did just marvelous ministry afterwards, and people did believe her because she'd been there. So was it God's will? How do you sort it all out? If we just are born and die over and over again, and through our life experiences we progress to this point of freedom, what is the point? This is the purpose of life altogether, isn't it? You see how everything, what is day to the worldly man becomes night to the yogi? What's night to the worldly man becomes day to the yogi. And I promise you, the deeper you meditate on this, I mean not just this, but everything we're talking about, the more it's just like this window of light just opens in front of you. I have been on this path for a very long time, relatively speaking, huge percentage of my life. I have never had one question that didn't have a good answer. I mean, that's really, that's saying a lot. And I'll add another testimony to that. I've never had to compromise my ideals. That's very unusual, isn't it? I was speaking to a young college student. She was a Stanford student. She was very drawn to this path, and I was very drawn to her. She was a wonderful woman. I really wanted to awaken her to this. I did not succeed. She was very afraid that if she went onto this path, she would lose other things that she wanted. So she asked me if I was happy. I probably was about 45 at the time when she asked me. I said, well, you know, you could ask anybody if they're happy, and most people will say yes, because most people don't want to admit if they're not, or their concept of happiness has been reduced to what they're experiencing. I said, I'll give you a different question to ask me. Ask me if I've had to compromise my ideals. In other words, if I've had to just accept that life was not really going to give me what I really wanted from life. And I said, I never have. Sometimes I've had to expand my understanding of what it is that I'm seeking. Definitely, because, you know, like this, from a perfect world in which everyone is happy, you move to here, and this is different in an understanding of God's plan. But I've never had to compromise. And I said, I said, I don't know hardly anybody you could ask who would answer that. And that's because of this. Yes.
What was she most afraid of losing?
Security in the world, and a kind of home, husband, babies, money, stuff like this. To her credit, she actually went back to Judaism and went to live in Israel. She married an Israeli and went to live in Jerusalem, which I think was her way of trying to elevate it a little bit. She was a very fine woman. I was really sorry not to keep her as a close friend. Yeah. But yes, because people see that because I want the world to be a certain way. And I'm afraid if I let God too much in my life that I'm going to lose control and He's going to take over. And if we're not yet set that God's will is the way to find happiness, and we're pretty sure that our plans are the best plans, there's a natural, a very natural fear comes in at that point. You have to be very, very gentle with yourself because it's a very natural fear. And you have to experience it a few times, or maybe 100,000 times. And then even then, someone I knew was going through something very, very difficult. Swami Kriyananda sent the message, "Why are you taking this so hard? What difference does it make?" And it was actually just a very good question. Well, it makes a lot of difference to me right now. But what difference does it really make? And I've meditated on that a lot. Depends on your point of view, doesn't it? If it's a Vaisha and you have to hold the world a certain way, it matters a lot. If you're a Brahmin and you're ready to accept everything as God's will, what difference does it make? Any other questions? If not, we'll have a little music and then call it a day. Okay?
Have you got a section on
This? I have a handout, a brief handout on it, which I will email to all of you because I didn't think to print it. Yes, Kavita?
This concept is also explained in Awaken to
That's right. Thank you. Exactly. It's in Awaken to Super Consciousness, which is a book on the table or a book that can be ordered for you. Yeah, Swami. Does Swamiji do the chakras at all in there? Kavita, does Swami do the chakras in Awaken to Super Consciousness?
There's a chapter on energy, but I don't know if it goes into the chakras. I don't think it does.
This is a song, actually, Swami Kriyananda wrote this in response to somebody who asked him to write a song for a bass singer. You know? So he wrote this song, which naturally expresses the highest ideals.
Life flows on like a river that homes to the sea. 1 hour bounding through mountain vales, 1 hour winding through a lea. None may linger on the way, none may coax time to stay. Fleeting scenes move by us like a dream. Cling not, none will be your own. Lest you grieve to be alone, go within you, there's your home.
Yes. That's a good song.
I didn't mind going on like a river, but that's
Yeah.
forever and skies never gray. But when I'm silent, free from all care, I discover my home's everywhere. Home is a green hill, home is a wind, blowing a trail far, far away. Home is the knowledge heaven is near. Home's the end of the fray.
I'd like to know if it's okay to ask you all to sing one verse of that with me, just to make it your own a little bit. You know, even if you're not singing, just to take it. Okay.
Home is a green hill, home is a wind, blowing a trail far, far away. Home is the knowledge heaven is near. Home's the end of the fray.
We have a choir here in New Zealand.
Every time we ask you to sing, you all sing very nice.
Uh-huh.
Believe me, not every group.